Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society and this latest in the series of talks from recent award recipients. And it's a real pleasure this evening to hand over to Joe MacDonald, who's our awards talk. And I'm just going to tease everyone by showing a copy of Liz's book, which she and Martha are going to be talking about this evening. So, Joe, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation between Professors Liz Wells and Martha Langford. Liz Wells is a writer, curator and lecturer on photographic practices and is Professor Emeritus in Photographic Culture at the University of Plymouth. Martha Langford is the Research Chair and Director of the Gail and Stephen A. Jarislowsky Institute for Studies in Canadian Art. There will be a Q&A after the conversation. Our next conversation is between Owen Harvey, who received the Joan Wakelin Bursary in 2022, and Roger Tooth, past head of photography at The Guardian. Please join us on the 29th of November. Over to you, Liz and Martha.
Okay, I think I'm leading off. So I, of course, want to start with a few words of thanks. First to the Royal Photographic Society, Joe, Michael, for hosting this lovely occasion. And of course, I want to thank Liz Wells for her generous invitations. First, to exchange thoughts in writing about her work as a historian, theorist, and critic. And now, with that anthology in our hands, to pursue this conversation in a launch that digs a bit deeper while celebrating her extraordinary contributions to the field of photography studies. In the past, Liz has concentrated attention on other people's writing. I remember well the excitement of being asked for one of my texts for her Photography Culture reader. My time had finally come. Indeed, each of Liz Wells' edited collections has been carefully conceived to meet a current need in the field. The book that we are launching with this conversation is no exception. But in one respect, photography curation criticism is different. This is an anthology of Liz Wells' own writing, assembled from journals, exhibition catalogues, and other anthologies. Essays and articles now become a bit hard to find, yet much deserving of further consideration in relation to current practices in the field of photography studies. This is also a compendium of art practices that have held her attention, not all, as Liz will explain, but a significant sampling. We want to delve into the larger questions that the book poses, themes that predominate, as well as critical approaches. But first, I wanted to ask Liz to say a few words about her intentions for photography curation criticism and her approach to editing it.
Thanks, Martha. There's a bit of a backstory. There always some years ago, I was at a conference and somebody said to me, an American professor said to me, "Where can I get hold of all your writings, Liz? I don't know where to look. And are you going to make an anthology?" I think this was around about 2016. And I sort of said, "Oh, well, maybe," and didn't think much more about it. And then in about 2018, I started to think, it's not a bad idea. Partly, I think, the classic, I knew by then I was probably going to retire from the university in 2020, and that it's a sort of classic retirement project, isn't it, to take stock of some of what you've been doing over the years. And then if you remember, Martha, when we were together in Montreal, when I was over visiting in 2019, you had generously agreed to participate in the form of a joint contribution to the book. And we had a long conversation about it. And then it was 2020 and it got put aside for a year or so because didn't really seem terribly important at the time. And then I came back to it. And I started the hard work of selection because actually there are 19 chapters. two of which are completely new, my introduction and the conversation that you and I had. But then there are 17 writings dating from the early 2000s onwards. And of course, that's not everything that I've done since. And I'm going to open a PowerPoint and share my screen if I can. You can see my whiteboard.
Just seeing your whiteboard, Liz.
Okay, I'll try that again. So
maybe just stop sharing and then go back.
Yeah, stop share. Yep. Here's my screen.
So if you just go to share screen and then look for the window that has your PowerPoint.
I've got it, yeah. And then I hit share.
There we go.
Come up this time.
Just
Good.
coming up now, and if you can take full screen, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if you can see this as well, but it tells me that Fergus Heron is waiting to. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so there are two sets of problems, of course. One of which is that a lot of my writing has been in photo books and directly referencing and very dependent on the collection of images, the artist's work, the photographer's work that it references. And the limitation of a Routledge publication is that you can only have a certain number of illustrations. So there were certain pieces that I'm very proud of or would have liked to include, but that simply couldn't work because the images couldn't be there. And one of the things about the anthology is there are 50 images with, I think, about 20 in colour. That's not very much if you're considering essays from artists' books. And then the other was what actually would make a balance. You know, there are certain photographers who I've worked with a lot. John Kippen is one, Crystal Labar is another. I didn't want the whole book to be shared between the two of them. So there were certain sorts of criteria. But anyway, we arrived at this. It's only the second book that is pretty well entirely my own writing. The first one was Land Matters, which I hope some of you are familiar with. And it went out of print very fast. And it was reprinted, handed over to Routledge and reprinted a couple of years ago. So this for me is, there's nowhere to hide, you know, when it's your own writing. You can't just let someone else take responsibility for the arguments. So it's in 5 parts. The first part, as you see, was this my introduction, and then an in-conversation between myself and you, Martha, which we decided to conduct by email because that's how we've been talking since the early 2000s. It was your suggestion. I said, well, should we be meeting on Zoom? You said, no, we always converse by email. Let's go on conversing by email. So we did. And you asked me some challenging questions. Thank you very much. Then a section on curation and residency, and then a section on phenomena. There are things to come back to and say about some of these. Then a large section on place, and then critical spaces, which in fact includes one of the earliest pieces, in 2 pieces from 2000, 2001. And one of the things I found quite interesting looking at this was that I tend to write about place, environment, land, territory, and so on nowadays. And I haven't really done the writing in terms of semiotics and critical spaces in quite that way so much recently. So here we are, and here is the cover for the book, which I hope stands out.
And this is where I wanted to jump in with a question, Liz, because you've obviously chosen this cover image very carefully. It's a picture from Maria Pirla's 2006 series Speaking House that has surely stayed with you as you included the work in your 2014 exhibition Light Touch at the Baltimore Washington International Airport. And now we have it as the portal to this collection. So please tell us what this work means to you.
Okay, so there were there were two. The Light Touch had work by 5 photographers, and I actually was trying to choose between 2 of them for the front cover. One was from Etudes Belval by Crystal Labar, and one was Speaking House. In the end, the Speaking House image works better in the cover format, in the portrait format for the cover. Crystal's work is the first image in the book, the frontispiece in the book now. I've always been interested in light, and that dates back a long way. The first thing I did after leaving school, in fact, before leaving school, I got very involved in amateur dramatics, and I got interested in light, and spent quite a lot of time following, trying to help with people who were doing the lighting and so on and so on. I ended up going to drama school, specialising in lighting design, and then working in theatre for the first 7 years. I went to university when I was 26. So I have this sort of background thinking about lighting, the effects of light, and also light in relation to theatre. And I now think slightly the other way round, as exhibition as a theatrical space. So that all sort of comes together for me. And then secondly, of course, qualities of light, mood, the expressiveness of light. And it's something that fascinates me. I go for the same walk every morning, but it's never the same walk because the light is always different, as along with other experiences like the wind and the rain and the people I bump into and the clouds and so on and so on. It's something that matters to me. And I couldn't possibly tell you which way round it is, whether it's sort of my being drawn to light that made me drawn to land, landscape, place, environment, or the other way round. It's completely intertwined. But it's a strand that runs through my life, so it seemed relevant. And I have shown Maria's work before in Facing East, so it's the second exhibition that I included her work. And actually, as a little offshoot from that, although completely unexpected, she has a massive retrospective coming up at the Taidehalli in Helsinki next year. It opens at the end of January. And very recently, I wrote a short essay for her publication to accompany that exhibition. So there's an element of there being an ongoing discussion going on there, sort of, over the years.
Well, it to me, it functions as a portrait of your mind. And I think it's, so Liz.
Just a quick addendum to that. You do know that, or you might not know, but the setting here, the house that she was exploring, it was a disused mental asylum. So I'm not sure what put in my mind.
Well, we'll let other people decide that question. Liz, you've been using words that are close to, adjoining the words for landscape. You've been talking about land, territory, place, environment. Your work speaks back to questions of ecology, of settlement, of occupation. Each of these words draws pictures in our minds and situates us as viewers. Considering that family of terms, its histories and complexities, I would like to begin our real conversation by acknowledging that I am joining this meeting from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Ganagahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. Historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, Tiohtià:ke Montreal is today home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. I would also like to add that I'm just back from a 2-day retreat on the future perfect of photography studies. De Montfort University's Gil Pasternak gave the keynote, and the University Art Association conference in Banff at the same time, where any mention of landscape and territory was arousing powerful emotion. We were counseled by spiritual advisor and healer Pablo Camille Russell of the Blackfoot Confederacy to model our actions on the buffalo. The buffalo, he explained, does not walk away from the storm, as that would only prolong the struggle. The buffalo walks into the storm to get through it more quickly. So in your anthology, Liz, you raise questions of images that disturb, and you refer to still and moving photojournalism. But as your work has also underscored, landscape is a repository of memory whose representation may be understood as a form of storytelling, trauma, or protest. So Liz, I wanted to ask you to reflect on places of conflict that you have brought forward in your curatorial and theoretical work, and how you have faced this work and worked through the material.
Thank you. Yes, good question. Images that disturb. The conflict can be conceptual. The conflict is not necessarily a sort of a literal battlefield or whatever conflict. So actually, when I'm thinking about disturbance, I'm thinking about encouraging a rethink. There's, pushing beyond preconceptions. There's a long history of that in photography reading and readings about photography, because I mean, Sontag talks about the image being the start, not the end of the thinking, but the start of the thinking, starting points for exploring the world. And there are many other examples of, for example, notions of alienation, Brechtian notions of alienation, where something unsettles in such a way that you don't sympathize with it, but you engage critically as a result of it. So I think that's what interests me. And I'm also interested in how photographers setting about telling the stories in ways that provoke. So the things that disturb are not really about things that go bump in the night. They might be about things being slightly out of place, as in seeing differently. They might be odd conjunctions, often spotted through what I'd call fresh eyes. For example, the essay Silent Witness that is in the 4th section of the collection, that's work by Oscar Palacio. And he's a Colombian who moved to the States. And it comes from his first publication, which was called American Places. And it's full of quirky observations, but actually they're his response to this unfamiliar place that he had relocated to. He arrived, I think, when he was about 19, studied photography, and then proceeded to look at the world around him. And it's a Robert Frank sort of notion. It's the stranger's eye. So again, there's nothing new about it, but through the attentiveness, the attentive seeing of the person who is possibly pursuing a project, but quite likely slightly out of place in order to do so, certainly if we're talking about land and environment, we are asked to think differently. And then there are some examples that are sort of actually evidently disturbing. Like, unfortunately, I couldn't include it in the anthology, but in the essay Icy Prospects, when it was first published, there was Elizabeth Williams had been working, who was a British photographer, undertook a residency in the Arctic in the middle of a winter because she wanted to experience what it was like to be a photographer working with limited light. That was the explanation she gave me. So she went in the middle of a winter, not in the middle of a summer. But she photographed her bare foot on a sheet of ice on top of a lake that she used to walk across. And it's very disturbing to see this conjunction of what you know is cold and what you know must be feeling the cold, the foot. Sometimes it's close-ups of, as I say, oddities, unusual things that make you pause for thought. Unfortunately, nobody who I know who knows her, nor me, none of us can find her at the moment. So I couldn't get permission to reproduce the photographs. They were not in the book. So they're described, but they're not here. But that would be sort of an example about asking us to think about something that we might not otherwise think about. And I think it's disturbing in that way. And I would also say that I think that often comes out of artists pursuing residencies, because they're then going to the place that they're seeing with new eyes for a length of time, possibly with a project to pursue, very often with a project that doesn't get pursued in quite the way that they imagined before they went there. And often I'm the writer piggybacking on this and trying to understand something about my preconceptions of where they've been through their eyes and the questions they raise through the images that they make. Does that sort of make?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that you've done this, for example, in Cyprus.
Yes.
So your morning walk in Cyprus would have prepped you to go into that seminar room and then talk to the artists who were in residence there.
Yeah, that's true. Although the very big difference there between, for example, the residencies that a number of artists undertook in the Antarctic that were nothing to do with me, and that exhibition and my essay came about retrospectively, in a sense, because they had been selected by the people at the British Antarctic Survey to make work. It was Arts Council supported, and then they were a group afterwards. And I've never been to the Antarctic, whereas in Cyprus, I went there before any of the artists did, and I was involved in setting up the residency. So I actually had walked the paths, not all the same paths, but
you knew all the cats.
I knew all the cats, yes. Whereas in the Antarctic, where I've never been, I am learning. I have preconceptions that are probably National Geographic preconceptions that got extended and disrupted through, first of all, the work, and secondly, in those days, way back in 2012, before everybody showed their portfolio online, I did studio visits with all the artists and spent a couple of years discussing the experience with them, which for me is, I'm really, really fond of doing studio visits, because you get insights into what people are thinking about. And that helps understand why the image caught their eye, and that in turn helps me understand a bit why they disturb, and they tweak something for you.
I think the image of the barefoot on the ice is a remarkable one, and of course it's precisely what or the way that many artists I know describe the notion of a residency. I mean, the clock is ticking, and they're there, and they have to do something, and so every sense is heightened, and anxiety is there. But I don't sense that with you, Liz, because I have always thought of you as a person who has a suitcase by the door. You know, you're a great traveler, and you're ready to go at all times, right? I think you find that very fulfilling, don't you?
Yes, but my traveling isn't usually in order to make work. It's a different thing. It's
It's to
usually
see it. It's to see it.
It's to
Yeah.
see it, or
Yeah.
to go to conferences and talk about what I have seen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also to critically reflect on and so on. I'm more likely, I'm very rarely traveling to write, although it has happened. I'm usually traveling to derive source material, I suppose. It's a different experience. I have done had two experiences that I think are perhaps a bit parallel in terms of trying to find your way into somewhere, and they've both been month-long stays in Spain learning Spanish, having to finding myself in a place that I don't know, and having to organize my life in a different way. Not as an academic, but as a student doing something completely different. And that's so different when I'm teaching in Spain, which I do sometimes as well. But so I don't think it's the same as for the artist, being out of place is a part of it. Because
it's a phenomenon, though, that can happen at home. And I'm thinking of, and I see John Kippen is in the audience, and I'm thinking of his critical landscape practice that you described so beautifully in one of your essays, against the, quote, jingoistic nationalism of the Thatcher years, and moving toward a, quote, more culturally diverse internationalism, but this then turning into a, quote, monstrous beauty. This is a beautiful synthesis of a story, of course, that was not finished at the point where John Kippen was making these photographs and really digging into and integrating personal and collective experience of place. Your essay was written for his 2018 retrospective, but I was very pleased to find it in the book as an artist. You were mentioning before we got started that you have been close to and involved with for a very long time. That's local. That's local.
But you said something about and not finished, but nothing is ever finished.
No,
things are transition points, aren't they? And you also talked about referenced monstrous beauty, which is a notion, or paradoxical beauty, which notions I quite often think about and indeed use. And two sets of things to say about that. One is it's a strategy that photographers often use as well. The last exhibition that I curated, which was Sea, Sand and Soil, Plastics in the Environment, was for a festival in China, Pingyao International Photography Festival. And I included work by Mandy Barker. And anyone familiar with her work will know exactly what paradoxical beauty refers to, because at first glance you've got these beautiful still lives, and then you see that they're made out of debris. So those sorts of things. But the other thing about beauty, and I do try to say something about this in my introduction, is that it's a notion that I've danced around all my life. I'm trying to get to hold myself to task and figure out what to say about beauty, because I'm really not interested in superficial beauty. And for a long while I thought I just don't deal with it. But I have tried to deal with it a bit, and I've started thinking very hard about integrity. Obviously the Robert Adams sort of notion of form and content and so on that he talks about, and the artist's motivations and aesthetics and all the rest, but also a doubling of the integrity of the photographers or possibly poets or possibly writers' purpose, and the doubling of the integrity of the object that they are writing about or photographing. So, for example, the plant that's behind you has its integrity as a plant, and then the photograph can either try to disrupt that, or it can actually honor that using form and content. But I do find this notion of beauty, perhaps because of quote unquote the beauty industry and all the rest, very problematic.
Yeah.
So you know, but on the other hand, I love a beautiful sunset, but I don't like endless photographs of yet another sunset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very few people can carry that off.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the terms that you're using, of course, the doubling, the juxtaposition, and so forth. I mean, these are elements that I've delved into a little bit in terms of the grotesque, and the grotesque not simply being the unbeautiful or the ugly, but always something that that is there in juxtaposition to make the ideal, the beauty, come to the eye and come to the mind and make it manageable, actually, not as a phenomenon that overwhelms, but as a phenomenon that one can enframe and deal with as a thought as well as a visual experience.
I have much less of a problem understanding the sublime, because you know, as in dealing with it, it's quite clear to me what that is. It's something completely momentous, you know, and
yes, exactly.
We can track it through Turner and the you know, his epic venture tied to the front of a mast. If that ever really happened, we don't know. But beauty is it worries me much more. The sublime, I think, is also something that photography, you know, engaged with land and place, has often dealt with, and often dealt with in interesting ways. So you've got a deep ravine, or you've got momentous things happening.
Right. And which brings me to another one of my themes, because of course, what happens when you bring decades of writing between two covers, and what happens when we bring a career into an exhibition space, or many careers into an exhibition space? You have this this possibility of fragmentation or anachronism, which is one of the words we've been tossing back and forth, and it's something that our generation was taught to consider a mistake. Anachronism is a mistake, and it's since been taken up by activists, scholars, and curators and critics as a tool to dislodge the master narratives, the big thoughts, right? To crack them open. And I think that remains very productive and interesting to me, and I think to you as well, Liz, especially having gone through this examination, this self-examination of your work on landscape, but landscapes.
Yes, it's interesting, that, isn't it? I mean, the sort of anachronism, something out of place, and so on. But then you start thinking about history and learning from history. People make history, but not under circumstances of their own making. Or traditions of dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living, and so on. So there is a relationship between the past and the present. If things are anachronistic, that actually might be the starting point for thinking about something. The Museum of the Home in London used to be called the Jeffrey Museum. Jeffrey was a philanthropist, but his wealth came from plantations. So now it's been renamed the Museum of the Home. But and all these Rasen is now Toronto Metropolitan University.
Yes, it is.
Engaging with the past is because of the debates that are going on in the present.
Yes.
is a part of actually moving the present on, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it is. It's a huge historiographical puzzle for people who are trying to write those big sweeping books like like the 3-volume history of photography in Canada that I've committed myself to. And it's quite true, you know, the Ryerson, for all of his sins, not to excuse him, but he was a leading educator in Canada, and trying hard to institutionalize practices that came very much from his religious belief and institutional sense of order, and all of that, bringing all the blind spots that it brings. So these accounts that we try to write of our past, I still believe they need to be written, and they need to be written into the present understandings. But they need to be written in depth. They really need detail.
Foucault's archaeology of knowledge is precisely trying to deal with that, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
It's analysing historical thought in order to understand how it's informing cultural presumptions historically and now, that, you know, creating cultural legacies. So that's a part of it. How that relates to photographic practices then, because critical practices, yes, from a historical theoretical point of view, yes, obviously we can have those debates, but then how you think that through practice or through writing about the practice of others is sort of almost a separate issue. It's certainly another element of challenge. And because you learn through thinking. I went to a Montessori primary school. I learned through play. I just thought I went to play. So the Montessori system is brilliant. I'm a great supporter of practice-led research.
Well, I think that I think that it's hard to avoid it at the moment, because the archival turn has plunged artists. I mean, we are being led by artists in this kind of work. I'm looking at Nikki Bird's name on the screen, and I feel like it's almost the third element in this discussion as we head into this area, because her work on this has been so important, and this then turns you back into the question of structuring the narratives that we bring and structuring the exhibitions that we give. I mean, we still cannot be completely chaotic. We still need to bring some of our order. And
there are 2 or 3 things there. One is, whose job is it to do what? And there aren't clear answers to this, but again, citing something I was working on recently. I was asked to write an essay about the work of a photographer who I've never met, but of course seen the portfolio and so on. Her work is on the Mennonites of Southern Illinois. And all I know about the subject matter is what I've learned through her work. So, of course, but her work is not in itself, she's not bringing a critical eye, she's bringing a curious eye. So, and she, in fact, was able to go and live with them for a period of time. So I think she started it as a master's project, actually, but then was able to continue it subsequently. So the question is, what is the relation between her curious eye, which has produced this body of work that she understands very much as a picture of a community that works the land, that is about place, but she's not taking the step back that you or I would take and think, well, how do we read this in terms of contemporary America? She might be thinking it, but it's not articulated through the work. It is not articulated through what she says about the work, because that's not who she is. She's a documentary photographer. And so how do we draw that into our considerations without imposing something that was never quite intended by the photographer. And that for me is always a question with writing essays and also with exhibitions. Came up again with Bleda y Rosa, who are Spanish artists, photographers, very much photographers, based in Valencia, Maria Breda and Jose Maria Rosa. And they did the series on the battlefields that is included, that I reference in one of the lecture-based essays. It's modes of intervention. And what they did was go to the sites of battles. Sometimes there are legacies, like in one case, there are two forts. At least we see two forts, it's the same fort, photographed from different angles. They will always put up a pair of photographs with a bit of a space in between, and then a caption that says the name of the battle that happened there 1,000 years ago in that case. In another instance, there are two photographs of the road from Tours to Poitiers, but there's no sign whatsoever of a battlefield there. There's no indication of fortification, and it says, I think it's 730 something the year anno domini 730 something. Absolutely no sign. If they hadn't told us in the caption, we wouldn't know what that image was about. Now, I think for them, there was a lot of epic journey. And in fact, what excited them was doing the research and going to the places. And some of the destinations were quite distant. What interests me about it is something very, very different, which is the way in which it's the John Berger quote about landscape serving as a curtain to hide what people's everyday experiences and so on and so on. I can't remember the precise quote, but the landscape that we see now is not what the project is about, but the photographers don't necessarily want to articulate or probe too much into what they're doing. They want to show without necessarily the telling bit, or hoping that the telling will come from the repeated showing, which is where you end up in a mediating role if you're writing a catalogue essay. But you have to try and respect where they're coming from and not impose. It's very different to writing, as you know, to writing a critical article for a magazine or something.
Oh, yes.
That's one of the things that interests me, is how you work with the photographer in a photo book or a context, or often an exhibition catalogue, as opposed to how you work when you're writing for a more critical space.
Well, I think it's a very intimate relationship, and I used to say, not that you have to fall in love with the artist. That's a mistake, and will keep you way too busy to do the writing. But in some way, you have to let your guard down or fall in love with the work, but also with somebody else on your shoulder, and that's the perfect stranger that you're trying to explain this work to.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and likewise the exhibition audience. I mean, coming back to light touch, which you mentioned earlier on, there's also the exhibition context. So the context of light touch was Baltimore Washington International Airport. They have
amazing.
Amazing space. And people won't go to see the exhibition. They will have time on their hands, so they will look at the exhibition. So you've got an audience that is utterly different to the sort of private gallery audience. Yeah?
Oh, of course.
And but you're also in an airport, and I was trying to say something about light and our relationship with environment. One of the most polluting aspects of contemporary life is aeroplanes.
Yes.
So
yes,
I called it light touch because it was about light, but also it had to be a light touch exhibition.
Yeah.
And actually be
And of course you're you're in an environment that, you know, has prompted you're in an environment of fear.
Yeah.
Many of the members of the audience will be scared to bits at the idea that they're getting on a plane at all. So yeah, it has to have that kind of soothing aspect.
Yeah, you just don't know who's looking at it and how they will engage with it. No, and there were
that's true.
There are 5 artists, so there's Crystal's work and Maria's work, and then Heidi Morstang, Frank Hallamday, and Lynn Silverman were the other 3 artists, and all variously looking at ways in which we experience light. But it was what was interesting about that for me was that I knew the audience would not necessarily be an art audience.
Right.
In fact, there was a lovely, I thought it was a lovely moment when one of the security guards came over to me and he said, looking at one of Maria's pictures, he said, "That picture's in the wrong place." And I thought, oh, he said, "It belongs in my living room." And I thought, he couldn't tell, you know, I sort of said, "Oh, that's very nice. What do you like?" He couldn't really articulate it, but he knew that it was speaking to him in some way.
Yeah, that's lovely.
You know, and there are all sorts of experiences that we've both had over the years, I think, of audiences taking a sort of completely unexpected or response, or making an unexpected response to work. Because once the work is out there, you frame it, the artists let the work go into the exhibition, you frame, you bring together, collate a whole series of different statements, point of views, concerns, and so on in the exhibition. But in the end, the exhibition, like a book, you have to let go of it and let the audience be engaged with it, which takes us back not so much actually to anachronism, but to disturbances, because actually, presumably that image, even if he couldn't articulate why, had disturbed him in some way. It might have disturbed him in a very pleasurable way.
Yes, and, the book you don't finish is the book you remember, right? That's the disturbance. The book you throw against the wall. We've seen a little invitation to drop questions into the chat, and I'm just wondering, given the time, whether we should. I have another question for you, but whether we should hear from the chat. What do we think?
Let's hear from the chat, and then move on to any questions.
There are 5 questions there, or at least people waving. So, Michael, are you going to read the chat?
I am. We don't have any in chat. I've had one that's come through to me directly.
Okay, so that's great. Okay.
And asking if Liz could perhaps give her views, and please join in, Martha, as well. Perhaps if Liz could give her views over how she thinks photography, this is a bit of a big question actually, if she can give her views over how she thinks photography has changed over her career and the approach to curating photography.
That is a big question. And I think it's a good one, though. Liz, what do you think?
I guess one of the things that's happened since my career in photography starts from the 1980s, because I came into writing about photography via writing about other things. So I came in via being offered, applying for a job speculatively for a magazine editorship, and the magazine was Camera Work in East London. One of the things that's changed is our conviction, you know, the truth of the image. Because whilst we may have all been skeptical, actually, when I first came into photography, imagery was still analog. And of course, it could always be faked, it could always be readjusted, and so on and so on. But I think now, in the however many years, gosh, nearly 40 years since then, nobody would argue for, we would argue in favor of authenticity, but we wouldn't argue that all images are necessarily authentic. And Michael, last time I saw you 2 weeks ago, we were talking about artificial intelligence, or rather I wasn't. I was sitting here enjoying myself listening, but you and others were talking about artificial intelligence and the import for photography. So there's a distrust that actually Sontag would have welcomed, wouldn't she? Because we ask, can this be true now, in a way in which possibly, I hope some of us did, but possibly many people didn't when I started my career. What else has changed?
Let me suggest something. It's funny. It threw me back. It threw me back to my start in photographic exhibitions, which was in 1975 at the National Film Board Still Photography Division, and I was in a very junior position. I was cleaning frames, having graduated from Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and sending things back out on the road. But the Still Photography Division had a huge dedication to traveling exhibitions. And this sounds like a very long preamble, but I'm coming up to my point. One of the things I think has changed, and I was going to say, seems to me, this is a typical elders comment, seems to me a bit of a loss, is that sense of multiplicity and simultaneity. That is to say, photographic exhibitions, a lot of them that we grew up with, for better or worse, were produced as multiples and consumables. And they went out into the world, and Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community, you knew that other people were seeing the same thing that you were seeing. And of course that was happening with magazines and so forth. And print culture is what he was talking about. But the shift that is the main shift, or one of the main shifts that's happened over my lifetime, has been the movement from the multiple silver, gelatin silver print that could be put out there in frames and put before people in shopping malls or in libraries or in very local situations. Now we're gravitating, and we've been gravitating for a long time, to major museums having exhibitions. That's where photography is seen. That's where it's shown. And of course it should be, but I somehow, again, it's the historian in me. I'm missing that kind of grassroots of people sending exhibitions from town to town, like itinerant, cinema used to be as well, and people coming out and seeing something together and having a good gab about it and so forth. I think we've lost a bit of that.
Yes, I mean, the classic one of those was Family of Man, wasn't it? Which circulated the world, but also camera work when I was working there, had exhibitions that went out on boards and all the rest. And they weren't, it's something to do with photography acquiring status within the art gallery. When I was first involved, if you asked somebody at the Tate what they were doing about photography, they'd say it was none of our business, And you went for photography, you went to the V&A, where, courtesy Mark Howarth Booth, the art of photography was cared for. But there was this, and the Photographers Gallery in London was founded to make a gallery space for photographs to be shown. There are various other, it's sort of, that spawned several around the country. I think what shifted is the relationship between photography and art in that respect.
Yes.
In other uses of photography have shifted, but in very different ways. The family album has shifted into social media. Photojournalism still has a job to do, but it has to do it frantically because everything moves so fast. And I was thinking earlier, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking that the question of image fatigue seems to be very pertinent at the moment for photojournalistic stories to have impact. I mean, so I think what's happened is that different spheres of photography have sort of shifted off in different, slightly more different directions. But community photography and community projects and working with communities and artists being embedded in communities and making projects and taking over shops or whatever to show the results seems to be actually quite lively, certainly here at the moment.
Yeah, I would say there less so in Canada at the moment. Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
because that's very much it's very much about. I was thinking about Joy Gregory's recent work where she was running workshops in Harrow Youth Centre or whatever that were about Caribbean lineages and legacies and plants and so on. You know, I think that's quite a lot of that level of activity that used to be called community arts, and transcended into being called, or shifted into being called, community photography or community photography workshops, which Half Moon workshop, that out of which camera work grew, was in the first instance, has now turned more into specific projects and funded as projects, but they're through residences or initiatives led by photographers. I don't know. I think the circumstances under which writing about photography happens have changed a lot. There's there are, in the UK, certainly, there are more academic journals than there used to be, specifically to do with photography. I co-edit one of them. There are fewer magazines, I think, of the sort of more throwaway sort, but there are some very established ones. I'm sort of thinking like Source has been going on for a long while and so on, and a lot more is happening online, and it's very fluid. It's more difficult to find. You know, it's about who you follow and what notifications you get.
Well, I think one of the things that has sadly disappeared, and again, I'm speaking from my experience of writing part 2 of my book, right, which takes us up to 1969, last advertisement for a book I haven't finished. But in that section, what you really encounter is a much broader distribution of some of the discussion that was going on about photography. It was in the newspapers. Every time someone says to me, well, there was no photographic criticism back then, I beg to differ. And this was the time of Marshall McLuhan, and people were knocking around pretty, experimental ideas in terms of, what television was doing to our brains and blah, 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 all of these things. And they were, in fact, there were psychology columns, sociology columns, art columns. These things were in the newspaper, and they weren't pumping a particular star talent, and they weren't pumping a particular blockbuster exhibition. They were always discussing the local.
But I think that's I think there are 2 or 3 things in there. One of them is that the multiple concern about, you mentioned Marshall McLuhan, well, artificial intelligence and the debates about that. I mean, I'm going to a session that the Society of Authors are running in a couple of weeks' time, which is bringing legal experts, copyright experts, it's looking at the future of writing in terms of artificial intelligence. And, this obviously that interests me as a writer. But that on the one hand. On the other hand, we're looking at something that's gone on in the museum and the museum sector, and the development of the art museum as a sort of trophy, so that there are major institutions, quite often former industrial spaces or newly built places, in almost every city in the world that are the art museum, the MoMA equivalent. And the fact that photography has become an integral part of that means that you get the whole limited edition photograph coming in, which is not the same as the reproduce, the
multiple,
the silver print, so on and so on. But the Gursky, of which only 5 are printed. If you want to borrow it, have it in an exhibition, you have to hope that one of the 5 are available. which
On the other hand, to be more optimistic, I hear of numerous exhibitions that are put together by photographers entrusting their files. No more airplanes, no more shipping of work around, right? So a much more ecologically minded thing. So the curator writes, may I have your file and print your photographs? Yes. At the end of the show, I promise to tear them up. Okay. And that's pretty interesting. It's getting a great long distance away from the notion of the single editioned image. I think there's room for, of course, there's room for all of these things.
Yeah.
But I don't like to give up on the kind of scrappy exhibition mentalities that of earlier years. I yearn for the Hackney flashers. I want to see.
But this may be generational, Martha.
Oh, do you think? And I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you, Liz, because I think it behooves us as we turn to those birthdays that have zeros in them, and we are elders now. We are elders, and I think we should be perhaps writing an advice column to the young, right? What do we urge them to keep hold of that has kept us going all of these years?
Oh gosh, keep history and philosophy and theory and criticism on the agenda. Don't just go out with your camera and shoot aimlessly. And
what about Rex Stout detective novels? Now I'm reading those. I'm on my second go through the Nero Wolfe series, and the whole business of doing research as detective work. I'm not the first person to have mentioned the connection, but
well, I mean, seeing photography as a means of investigation, not just reportage, but asking questions through it. Michael,
I'm going to interrupt you. I think this conversation is going down a particular road. I'm just going to pull you slightly back. We've got a question here from Val Williams asking to you, Liz. In your book Land Matters, you suggest walking, engaging space and time. Is this still true for female landscape photographers?
Walking, female. I don't know is the answer to that, because it depends on the place. Hello, Val, by the way. Because when I first started writing about women in landscape, or at least I did an exhibition in 1992, women landscape photographers in this country were not very well known. Then there was a lot of discussion about safety and so on as well, and the sort of nature of landscape and being out on your own and exploring land. In fact, a lot of women are and were exploring place in familiar spaces and so on. I think what's changed is that there aren't issues around women's participation in photography. And there's been a shift there, and some of the questions that, Anna Fox in particular has taken forward through the Fast Forward movement, a lot of outreach in terms of facilitating debate, both facilitating women's practice, but also drawing attention to it internationally. I still think there are questions around safety, but I think they're perhaps more diffused than I would have seen them earlier. But then also, Val, speaking as older women, you feel safer, don't you, on the whole? Nobody follows me down the street.
Okay, I think I'm going to just pull it back. I think we've got time for a final question. We're slightly over time, but it's such a fascinating conversation so far that I'm going to just pull in this final question before I bring matters to a close, from Sean, asking again to you, Liz. Did you ever consider moving from Routledge in order to produce the book without the limitations on the illustrative images? Very practical question.
It's a very good question. I've always aimed to be working with more than one publisher. So at one point I was working with Routledge on textbooks and IB Tauris on, for example, Land Matters. And then also became a series editor for Bloomsbury for the series that I edit, which is on photography, place, environment. And then Bloomsbury acquired Taurus, so then I had two publishers, and then Routledge acquired Bloomsbury, so then I'm entirely in the one factory. And to answer the question in another way, financing books, I wanted to do a book in 2020 that was a major photo book. I would have had to have raised 40 grand. I don't have 40 grand, but that was what it was going to cost to get this get a beautiful, ecologically, with ecological integrity, i.e. printed on proper sustainable paper and so on and so on. And it would have been a book of work by 15 photographers, all of whom have asked questions around seeds and sustainability. And if anybody's got 40 grand in their back pocket, I've still got the folio of work sitting on this computer. Familiar system, you don't have to raise the funding, but one of the limitations is the number of photographs that they will let you have, because that's one of their cost elements.
Okay,
so yes, I've considered it, but it's just not practical unless you're not me or somebody in a different position to me. Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to bring the evening to a conclusion. So firstly, if I can thank Martha for your conversation with Liz and actually bringing quite a lot of that sort of the book to the surface, I think. And also I'd love to get you back when the first, at least, of your 3 volumes on photography in Canada come to publication, because it sounds fascinating. I'm sure that's going to be equally interesting to us photo historians. And Liz, what can I say? I would recommend everyone gets a copy of this book. We will be sending round a link for a discount code to the publication. I've been looking at it over the last few days and it's been engaging me. And there's so much to read here, and there's so much breadth of knowledge that's distilled in here. I can't recommend it highly enough. So Liz, thank you for sharing your insights with Martha this evening, and congratulations on your J. Dudley Johnston Award for Photographic Criticism. And this is a good example of the quality of your work over many years. So on behalf of the RPS, I'd like to congratulate you for that. And finally, just like to say thank you, big thank you to Joe McDonald, who's arranged this evening's talk. Joe puts a lot of work into these talks, and we appreciate that. And we have one more coming up at the end of the month, which we'll send out details about. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Martha. And thanks again, Joe. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.